Hey guys, Quiv, the lazy geek here, and today I want to talk about plate solving in N.I.N.A and how it's used, what settings are necessary for it, and what you need to configure, including external programs, because N.I.N.A itself does not do plate solving. It just sends plate solving commands or requests to third-party programs and gets back an answer. Plate solving is basically a means by which you can know where a telescope is pointed to, its precise coordinates, and then if you know where your telescope is pointed to versus where the telescope thinks it is pointed to, you can basically compute an offset or sync the telescope and then make it slew to the proper target and then tell it like you are now on target. In a way, this is what visual observers kind of do when they do the alignment of a go-to telescope. Upon starting up the telescope, the telescope will slew to whatever bright star, Betelgeuse, for example, and the user will center it and will say, yes, now I am at Betelgeuse. Basically, this is manual plate solving in a way. The telescope thought it was pointed at Betelgeuse. The user actually centers it to Betelgeuse and tells it this is where it is. We do the same thing, but programmatically with N.I.N.A and a third-party software. Now I'm going to share my screen to show you how it looks like. So here we have the plate solving screen, which is under Options Plate Solving. And you can see that the main options that tell you what plate solver you're going to use are here under Plate Solver and Blind Solver. Plate Solver is basically when N.I.N.A can actually send information about where your telescope think it is pointed to and what the apparent field of view of the telescope is. The apparent field of view depends on your focal length and on your sensor size. With that information, N.I.N.A can send this information to the plate solver along with a capture of the sky area right now. So it can send basically a starscape to the plate solver along with information about where it thinks it is pointed and the field of view. And so the plate solver will very efficiently look in the immediate vicinity of that area until it finds a match and can tell N.I.N.A like, okay, you thought you were pointing there, actually you're 1 degree off, you are pointed here. And from there, N.I.N.A can basically recenter the telescope and then try again to validate that the plate solving was successful and the recentering was successful. The second part, the blind solver, is basically a backup to the plate solver, and that backup is basically used when we're making the assumption that where we think we are pointed to is fundamentally wrong, or our apparent field of view is fundamentally wrong, and so we ask the plate solver to find where we are in the sky without any hint about where we think we are or what our field of view is. Obviously, this is something that will take longer and is more computationally intensive because your plate solver has to scour the entirety of its sky database to find like where the heck you are actually pointed to. And you can choose a different plate solver for each. And you can see that you have different settings for each plate solvers here. My main plate solver for me is ASTAP, which I really like. It's extremely fast, although it is very sensitive to star streaks. So if the stars are slightly elongated, it has trouble actually detecting the stars and will fail very often. So there's one thing that I want to say about plate solving is that to avoid star streaks, you want to make sure that your telescope has finished slewing before you take a plate solving exposure. And especially when you're centering a target, the telescope will slew, plate solve, find its difference between where it thinks it is pointed and where it wants to be pointed at, then slew again, then plate solve again. And each time it plate solves, it takes an exposure. If it's still like slightly moving when it's taking exposure, you will have star streaks, and that will affect ASTAP. So one of the things you want to check is under your equipment tab, you have the telescope and you have the settle time after slew, which I have set to 15 seconds here. Just to be sure that my telescope is fully slewed, is not moving, besides just the tracking of the stars when I take my plate solving exposure. While we're at that screen, you can see that I have my focal length and my focal ratio is almost irrelevant for apparent field of view, but focal length is used to compute apparent field of view. You also have the pixel size of your camera, and also you know what the resolution of the camera is. This is something that N.I.N.A can get directly from the camera using the pixel size, the size of the sensor in pixels, and the focal length. We have all of the information to compute the apparent field of view and send that to the Platesolver. So all of those options are actually used during Platesolving. We have another option here that is called no sync. This is something that the guy who created N.I.N.A actually added recently, and I think it's absolutely awesome. It's the logic up to when this option was added in a few weeks ago, was that the telescope would slew, Platesolver would be done, and then we would send what is called a sync command to the telescope to tell it, like, okay, you thought you were pointed here, you are pointed there actually. These are the coordinates you are pointed to at right now. And then the telescope would correct itself and like say, oh, okay, this is where I am pointed at. And then you can tell the telescope like, okay, good boy, now you know where you're pointed at. You can now slew to my target coordinates, and the telescope will move to the target coordinates. The problem with that is that with some telescopes or some telescope drivers, for example, EQ Mod, which controls many Skywatcher telescopes, does not like sensing near the meridian and will give an error. Or if you have like advanced computerized telescopes that have a sky model using like tens of or hundreds of reference points across the sky, you do not want to sync because that could actually disturb your sky model. So now you have the option to not sync. In addition to this option, in the background, what has been done under the hood is that if that N.I.N.A will check whether the sync command, when that option is off, that it's sent to the telescope, whether it succeeded or not. If it succeeded, it proceeds as usual. If it did not succeed, it computes an offset between your target coordinates and the coordinates that have been found by the Platesolving, and uses that offset to kind of manually slew the telescope to the right area, which is what it will do by default when you have the no sync command or setting set to on. So this is a super powerful new option that the creator of N.I.N.A added, and it should be like, people should be more aware of that, because I think it is a very big change and it's a very convenient change. It's really awesome in my view. Okay, so enough with that, let's go back to Platesolving. And my main Platesolver is ASTAP. Many people use Platesolve 2 as well, especially people who crossed over from Sequence Generator Pro. I personally love ASTAP. So to get ASTAP, you can simply go on their website, download the installer, and to go to their website, you just Google for ASTAP Platesolver, and then you can install it. And I'll just like install the latest version, since I see that there was a new version yesterday while I'm at it. So it's as simple as just installing it to its default folder, and there we are, we're done. So that's easy to install. And when I look into settings for ASTAP here, you can see the only thing I need to do is to put the path to my ASTAP location, which is just you click the three dots and then you navigate to program files, ASTAP, and then astap.exec. That's pretty much it, unless you installed it in a different folder, in which case you navigate to where you should be. We also have things like the search radius, the downsample factor, and maximum objects. You typically don't need to touch those. The downsample factor 2 is typically good. It's basically how much you will like resize the image by. So you took a picture of the star field, and then we just reduce the size by a factor of 2. And before we send it, or actually we let ASTAP do that on its own, and we send that as a command to ASTAP. Typically, it should not be changed. If you see you have issues, you can try setting it to 1 or to 0, and 0 lets ASTAP actually automatically decide what downsample factor it should use. The search radius is how many degrees. It's a radius of in degrees around where you think you're pointed at that ASTAP should search for. And maximum object is the maximum number of stars that ASTAP should identify from the star field image that is being given to it. But I've never even touched those options, so you typically don't need to touch them. My blind solver is astrometry.net, which is online. Sometimes astrometry.net is down, which can be a problem. It also takes a couple of minutes for results to come back from astrometry.net, whereas ASTAP can be like near instantaneous. It's absolutely amazing. ASTAP can also do blind solving, but I noticed that astrometry.net is more tolerant of poor star shapes, like disturbed by wind or by the slew still going on. And so I like to have astrometry.net as my solver. And one of the things with astrometry.net is that you need to set an API key. And to do that, you actually need to go to nova.astrometry.net to create an account. And once you've created an account, it's free. You can simply go to your homepage and you'll see an API key there. And you can just copy paste that API key into N.I.N.A here. Make sure you don't have a space at the end or a space at the beginning, because that could mess up your API key. So that's very simple to set those two. Platesolve 2 is probably very similar. You just set up a location, and I haven't really used All-Sky Platesolver or Local Platesolver. I think Local Platesolver is basically a local instance of astrometry.net. I haven't tried to really set that up before, and I won't even try now. So I'll stick to what I'm familiar with. So those are the settings for actually choosing which plate solvers you want to use, because N.I.N.A is not the one doing the actual work for plate solving. It's external pieces of software. And on top of that, you have things like the exposure time, the filter you want to use for plate solving, the binning of the camera. So if I choose a binning of 2, the camera will take a square of 4 pixels and consider that as 1 pixel. The advantage is you get a better signal to noise ratio. The disadvantage is you get fewer pixels per star. But for plate solving, it shouldn't matter that much. You can also choose a custom gain for your camera if you want to do plate solving with short exposure and a very high gain. And you can also choose a plate solving filter, right? So you could always use the current filter, or you could say that you always want to use the luminance filter. And if you want to do that, you want to make sure that your filter offsets, which I've covered in another video here, are properly set up. If they're not, this will fail, because then you'll be out of focus when you try taking the plate solving exposure, and that will basically make the plate solving fail. So let's go back here. You have other things like the pointing tolerance, which is how much error do you accept when you're centering your telescope on targets. 1 arc minute, 2 arc minutes, like how far do you accept to be away from your target. You have the same thing, the same principle for the rotation tolerance if you have a rotator connected. I don't. I've never used a rotator. Sometimes I wish I had one, but hey, I don't. So I've never really used that option. Then we have number of attempts and delay between attempts, and those two settings are almost a form of sequence recovery, in that if you have a problem when you're trying to plate solve after the meridian flip, for example, then it could be that there are clouds or things that prevent the plate solving from working, in which case with those settings, N.I.N.A will wait 10 minutes, then attempt a second time, and then it will wait 10 more minutes and attempt a third time, and if it fails all those times, then it will just like abandon the plate solving and try to just take sequence exposures and hope for the best. So that's a very basic form of sequence recovery that we have here. So these are all the settings we have for plate solving. Now let's see how Platesolving is used. You can use Platesolving from two spots really. You can use that from the imaging tab under Platesolving, and here you can see that whether you want to sync and re-slew to targets. Now sync, now you know that it might actually not sync if you have the option that I showed earlier set to on. It's just saying that you want to basically compute that offset in that case. And do you want to re-slew to target? Basically, do you want to center the target until it is centered by 2 arc minutes, and the exposure time is this, and the filter is this, and the binning is this, and the gain is this. So you can kind of override the settings that you had in the Platesolving tab here for a one-off Platesolving. Now when you press the play arrow there, or the start button here, what happens is, like, it's confusing sometimes, like which coordinates is it thinking about to be the target coordinates, right? Where do you try to point to? It will actually take the coordinates that the telescope thinks it is pointed at, so what the telescope actually reports to N.I.N.A. The telescope tells N.I.N.A. at all times, like, hey, I'm pointed here. And this is what it will use as target coordinates to center on. If, on the other hand, I go on my sequence screen, I have my slew to target and center targets set to on, those will by default not use what the telescope reported is pointed at. It will use the target set here if there is a target set. If it's as it is right now, it will default back to the telescope reported coordinates. Now, sometimes I've seen some funky stuff happen with telescope reported coordinates, and so I typically recommend to have a center target and slew to target on when using a sequence, so it always uses these target coordinates, including during the meridian flip. If you do not do that during the meridian flip, it will use the coordinates reported by the telescope, and if those coordinates have changed, which I have seen happen with Vixen telescopes and EQ mod telescopes, then you might recenter after the flip to a wrong place, like slightly off target. And this was one of the causes for issues with the meridian flip in N.I.N.A. And this was enhanced in N.I.N.A 1.10, if I remember correctly. So these are the two spots where you can use Platesolving. And let's use it right now. Let me slew to the needle galaxy here. Okay, let's wait until this slew is done. Oh, okay. And now the slew is done. So let's go to the imaging tab and to Platesolving. And I'm going to say that let's take first an exposure to kind of see where we are located at and whether we are in focus. That's also something important. We're somewhat in focus, and I don't see a needle galaxy anywhere, so I'm going to go to Platesolving and I'm just going to launch it. I'm going to set filter, binning, gain to empty because I don't want to override any of that. I'll just leave the exposure time at 10 seconds. We're going to wait 10 seconds until the exposure is taken. That exposure will be sent to ASTAP, and hopefully ASTAP will find the coordinates. And here you see already, like, ASTAP was instantaneous. It found the coordinates almost immediately. You can see that I am at an error distance of almost 3 degrees, and the telescope is not inside tolerance. So we're sensing the scope, and now we're actually slewing the scope to the target. I can hear the scope slewing. Then once the scope has slewed, it will wait for the 15 seconds that I have set in my settle time before it takes another exposure. As you can see, it's already finished slewing, but it's still on re-slew to target because we are now in the settle time to make sure that we do not get star streaks in the next exposure. And now it has started to take that next exposure. And once it is done, ASTAP will work again. And now we are at an error distance, so ASTAP has already finished. Again, instantaneous. ASTAP is absolutely awesome as well. And we are now at an error distance of only 31 arc seconds. So we are quite on target. And if we look at the image, then yes, you can see the needle galaxy is dead on at the center of my image. And so this is how overall Platesolving works in N.I.N.A. It's quite a bit of work to set up, but once it's set up, it's such a huge difference. That's why, I mean, even for beginners in astrophotography, I really recommend a go-to mount rather than a star tracker, because there is so much less frustration in just letting the computer and the telescope just talk to each other, determine everything, and just center themselves beautifully. It's magical, and it makes a world of difference. And that's it for this explanation. So if you liked it, if you found it useful, please like and please subscribe. And well, add any comments, remarks, things you'd like me to cover, and see you next time. Thank you very much.